in philosophy who specializes in social and political philosophy. He is the director of the OSU Peace Studies program and co-director of the NARS Project for Alternative Futures. He is also the author of Cesar, Chavez, and the Common Sense of Nonviolence.
So thank you all for coming here today and sharing time with us to discuss these issues. I want to thank Professor Simon for organizing this and for Paul Peckney for doing all the technical assistance. Thank you all for your time and patience and consideration. Thank you to my fellow panelists who have given us a lot to think about and to contemplate and to meditate upon. Before I came here, I was in class, and I was telling my class that I was going to be doing this, and I invited them to be here. And I was packing up my things at the end of class, putting things in my backpack, and a couple of students came up to me and they said, well, you know, Professor, we can't come to the panel because we have something else to do, but we just wanted to talk to you a little bit about Baltimore before you leave. Do you mind? And I was like, sure. What can I do? So the young man asked me, well, I wanted to know about the violence in Baltimore, the rioting, what was going on, and the gang members doing this and that. And do you think the violence was justified? And being a philosopher, I said, well, it depends on what you mean by violence. What do you talk about? And he goes, well, you know, the CBS, that stuff. Is that justified? And what I told him was, I said, what I'm going to talk about this afternoon is pointing out that maybe that's the wrong question to ask about Baltimore. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of people who want to answer that question. Notably, our president, Barack Obama, was asked this question, and he immediately had to provide an answer to this. And in fact, he said, no, of course not. What happened in Baltimore was not justified. It's not a legitimate protest. In fact, he says, there's no excuse for the kind of violence that we saw yesterday. It's counterproductive. When individuals get crowbars and start prying open doors to loot, they're not protesting. They're not making a statement. They're stealing. And when they burn down a building, they're committing arson. And they're destroying and undermining businesses and opportunities in their own communities. That robs jobs and opportunities from people in that area. So there's this perspective that folks have. People want to weigh in on this question. But what I wanted to say here today is I think that we should avoid playing this game about what's legitimate and illegitimate violence in terms of what happened at Baltimore and what's going on in these kinds of images. And instead, I want to listen to some of the words of folks who have addressed these kinds of incidents. Particularly, I want to pay attention to the words of Martin Luther King and Cesar Chavez. Right, and so the kind of thing that Martin Luther King asked us to do, he asked us to consider this. Let's not ask that question. Right, in fact, many of you probably saw this meme that floated around on social media quite a bit. Dr. King reacting to things going on in the summers of 66, 67, 68, right, all those different uprisings in urban areas. And Dr. King in 1968 writes, it is not enough for me to stand before you tonight and condemn riots. It would be morally irresponsible of me to do that without, at the same time, condemning the contingent, intolerable conditions that exist in our society. And in some sense, right, I want to give some consideration to our historians who have asked us to think along the ways that Dr. King was asking us to do. Not to ask, is it legitimate or not what these folks were doing in Baltimore, but to ask, what are the conditions under which these people live that gave rise to their frustrations, their pains, their miseries in various ways, that doing the kinds of things that they did in the property destruction that took place was, for them, the only way that they could express their anger, frustration, pain that had been built up for many generations. This is what Dr. King asks us to do. These conditions are the things that cause individuals to feel that they have no other alternative than to engage in violent rebellions to get attention. And I must say that tonight that a riot is the language of the unheard. Right, so what Dr. King asks us to do is to broaden our perspective and to ask, what kind of communities are we speaking about? What's going on in these conditions, in these communities, such that folks feel that they have to speak in this language with these discourses? And as we've heard, Professor Chappell is talking about, where there's a whole sort of various ways in which the Baltimore community has been eviscerated by neoliberal economic policies and austerity measures that have bankrupted public schools, have decimated public services and welfare offices, right? There's all sorts of various ways in which jobs have left, right? Schools have been destroyed, opportunities have been lost, right? Housing has been destroyed. So there's various kinds of ways in which we can imagine these structural problems. And this is what Dr. King asked us to think about, is structural violence. How are the ways in which our communities are structured causing and conditioning and influence people to act in various kinds of ways that we might call violent or uprisings? To think about that. So an analysis, a responsible analysis, a moral analysis, is not one that focuses on what looters were doing in the streets. A morally responsible understanding of these problems is about understanding the structural issues in these communities. Now, what I want to offer here as a suggestion is that I think that there's another dimension in this morally responsible analysis. Dr. King sort of primes us to think about structural violence issues. But the person who I work with in a lot of ways is Cesar Chavez, and I wrote a book on his philosophy of nonviolence. And in 1971, he was asked at a rally in Los Angeles to think about the Vietnam War. And there was a mother who had lost her son in the Vietnam War and received his medals. And she said that she felt like throwing them away, and in fact throwing them in protest at a government building to show that how she was just so enraged at the fact that she had lost her child for this immoral war. And Cesar Chavez, former leader at that time, said, "I have 8 children. I can't understand what that pain would be like to lose someone for a war that we both, my son and I, disagree with. I can't understand what that would be like." And so he started to reflect, and he started to think this way. And so this is a rather long quote, but it's hard to see on the screen, but let me read this for you. This is Cesar Chavez in 1971. "What causes our children to take up guns to fight their brothers in lands far away? In our case, thousands and thousands of poor brown and black farm workers go off to war to kill other poor farm workers in Southeast Asia. Why does this happen? Perhaps they are afraid. Or perhaps they have come to believe that in order to be fully men, to gain respect from other men, and to have their way in the world, they must take up the gun and use brute force against other men. They have had plenty of examples. In Delano, Salinas, and Coachella, all the growers carry gun racks and guns in their trucks. The police all carry guns and use them to get their way. The security guards, rent-a-cops, carry guns and nightsticks. The stores sell guns of all shapes and sizes. It would be easy to put all the blame on the generals and the police and the growers and the other bosses, or on violence and TV or the movies or war toys. But we are also responsible. Some husbands prove to their children that might makes right by the way they beat their own wives. Most of us honor violence in one way or another, in sports, if not at home. We insist on our own way, we grab for security and trample on other people in the process. But we are responsible in another, more basic way. We have not shown our children how to sacrifice for justice. Say all that you want about the Army, but in time of crisis, the Army and the Navy demand hard work, discipline, and sacrifice. And so too often our sons go off to work grappling for their manhood at the end of a gun and trained to work and to sacrifice for war. He continues, "For the poor, it is a terrible irony that they should rise out of their misery to do battle against other poor people when the same sacrifices could be turned against the causes of their own poverty. But what have we done to demonstrate another way? Talk is cheap, and our young people know it best of all. It is the way we organize and the way we use our lives every day that tells us what we believe in." What I think Cesar Chavez is asking us to think about here is not just the economic, structural issues that underlie violence in communities like Baltimore, Ferguson, or Dallas. Those are important analyses to do. But he's also asking us to think about the stories that we tell ourselves to justify being safe, to be made sense of our lives as good people. And then once we start to examine questions about the stories we tell, we get to this question that Johann Galtung, the father of peace studies, calls the triangle of violence. That violence, when we talk about violence, we're usually talking about something, this kind of eruption, right? The looting of CVS, these sort of images that sort of pop up. But once you start to examine these causes about where these eruptions take place, you start to realize that there are deeper causes, deeper foundations. One of them is the structural violence of economic and loss of opportunity. Cultural violence, though, has to do with the stories that we tell ourselves about how we live our lives that can be used to justify violence, right? And so Cesar Chavez is saying here, right, think about how we think about our self-identity, how we tie masculinity, for instance, to notions of violence and getting our own way. And that in order to be a man, a young man, must think about how to dominate others. These are cultural stories that we use to think about our lives and what it means to be a good person, what it means to be strong and able and there for other people. He asks us to think about the stories that we tell that can be used to justify violence. And I think that when we think about things like Baltimore and Ferguson, maybe we ought to ask certain kinds of questions. Ask ourselves what stories we tell about things like mass incarceration and militarized police. So many people have been raising questions like, this is a picture from Ferguson, like this was a young gentleman who was involved in some of the protests that were back last summer and being confronted by this heavily militarized local Ferguson police force. Many people at the time are asking, why do police forces need to look like this? Right? Why do they need such heavy weaponry? Why do they have to do this? And the answer was, well, in order to be safe. We need certain things in order to feel secure in our communities. And so I think we have to think, how have we convinced ourselves that we need to be safe? One of the things that I think many folks who are involved in this work have been asking is to say, maybe we need to understand, maybe we need to question the story about whether we need police in our community. There's many, many different activists now who call themselves police abolitionists, who are trying to imagine what would it look like not to have better police in our communities. What would it in fact mean to have little to no police in our community? And some people say, that's crazy. That story is science fiction, it's fantasy. We need police in our communities in order to be safe. That's the story we tell. Right, as we've heard, right, police as an institution in our societies is a relatively recent institution. We didn't always have police. So what did people do before we had police to be safe? Police abolitionists who are doing this kind of work are studying what police do on a day-to-day basis, and at least according to one analysis, right, if you look at what police officers do throughout the day, 90% of their work is paperwork and code enforcement. Right, so are they stopping criminals? Well, if you mean by criminals people who are doing things like littering or have broken taillights or these kinds of things that are generally nuisances to public life. Right, and this one analysis suggests that arresting criminals and doing that kind of thing to make it safer probably really only accounts for about 10% of a police officer's work each and every day. Right, and so for most of the time what police are doing is protecting property and keeping nuisances away from the good people. And so what many people are starting to wonder about this world that we created in which so many young African American, Latino, and Native people are in prisons in the United States, and we have these militarized police forces, is to ask, do we really need these institutions? What are the stories that underlie and justify the existence of these institutions in our modern life? And to ask, can we tell a different story? Can we talk about decarcerization and abolishing prisons by perhaps reducing drug crimes, reducing the number of people who are there for nonviolent offenses? That would eviscerate federal prison populations enormously if we did something like that. And many people are even pushing this, like I said, more radically to think about what would it mean for communities to build up resources and crisis centers, various kinds of community resource offerings that would deal with the problems in their community that they now pass off to police officers. What would that look like? And there are experiences that we've had in which communities have tried to do it for themselves in various ways to deal with their security, to deal with their service. Of course, the most notable example, of course, is the Black Panthers. But other communities have done this as well. The Mexican-American Chicano community has the Brown Berets in Los Angeles. Chicago, New Jersey, New York have the Young Lords. There have been various radical propositions in which young people have come together and decided the world in which there are police officers on every block and we expect ourselves or our friends and neighbors to go to prison, this world we don't want. We're trying to imagine a different world in which our communities take care of one another, provide for one another. And I think that what Cesar Chavez is asking us to do is to think, what would it be for us to engage in that kind of organizing, in this imaginative process of trying to think about a different kind of story that we can tell about our communities and about security. And we owe it to the question about justice to think about how we think those stories and how we build those kinds of worlds. And that's what it means to think morally about incidents like Baltimore.